Attention local government leaders, don't miss Fast Track 2025, Victoria's premier councillor leadership forum, happening Friday, May the 2nd. Join us for an intensive day focused on leading with integrity, featuring an exceptional lineup including Melbourne Lord Mayor Nick Rees, Victorian Ombudsman Marlo Barraguareth and IBAC CEO Alison Byrne. Gain valuable insights on conduct, fraud prevention and CEO management while networking with industry peers. Plus, enjoy a special keynote from comedian Anthony Lamo-Learman. Fast Track 2025, equipping you with the tools to serve your community better. Register now at the VLGA website. Hello, welcome to a special edition of the Local Government News Roundup. It's another instalment in our popular Well-Travelled Executive series, where I speak with leaders from in and around the local government sector about their career journeys, professional and personal highlights, lowlights and learnings, and in some cases we get some insights into what might be next for them in their careers. As always, the podcast is brought to you by the Victorian Local Governance Association, the national broadcaster on all things local government, with support this month from Symphony 3, Simple Connected Customer Experiences. I hope you enjoy today's episode of the Well-Travelled Executive Series. My guest today on the Local Government News Roundup Well-Travelled Executive Series is Alastair Dawson, an experienced senior executive, not just in local government, but in other sectors as well, and across multiple states. And I want to have a chat about Alastair's experiences with the sector over the years. Alastair, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on. It's a real pleasure. Look forward to the conversation.
Great to meet you. You've worked in, I think, at least 2 states in local government, nearly a third, and we might talk about why I say nearly a third. What's your earliest recollection of getting involved in local government?
My career started in local government, actually in a shire called the former Albert Shire, which is a precursor to the Gold Coast City Council. It was at the time I think it was one of the largest councils in Queensland, and I started my career in the events management and public relations. In fact, I was one of the first PROs in local government, which probably shows my vintage more than anything else. In that space, organising major events and looking after PR for the council at the time. So that's where I started. And I predominantly in the early days worked in bigger councils like Logan, and then into Brisbane way back in the 90s.
I was going to say, so roughly what time period are we talking about with that first role?
Yeah, so that was early 90s. So that's tended to giving away my age a bit more by that stage.
And there's been some restructuring, as there has, I think, in most states as you head around the nation. But were you in the sector when some of those council amalgamations and changes happened in Queensland?
Yeah, and it was an interesting time. And, there was a lot of consternation. I was the Chief Executive Officer for a small council called Beaudesert Shire Council, which was on the southern end of Brisbane. Council of about 70,000 population, but it had projected a growth of about 200,000 within 25 years. It was the growth area that all of Brisbane was spilling out to. And I was essentially recruited out of where I was in Victoria to lead that transformation because it'd been a council that hadn't done anything for 20 odd years and it needed to rebuild everything. Couldn't get planners, couldn't get anyone who wanted to go out into that sort of region. So huge opportunity. But it was fairly safe National Party headquarters sort of areas. And when the amalgamations were on, we knew that Beaudesert days were going to be determined that way. So I actually spent most of my time there actually managing the transition from a council to an amalgamation of two other new councils for which was almost a couple of years worth of effort and quite a strong learning experience because you have people who actually don't want to transition out of that council either to retirement or to a council that they didn't ever want to work for or to a new council. And so dealing with those as a CEO and having to deal with those one-on-one, not just being the logistical planner and the decision maker, because that was the case for CEOs, in that forced amalgamations, but also having to deal with people who were, we had staff members who had worked in that council for 40 years
Mm.
and didn't know what they were going to do beyond that part. So having to deal with them one-on-one for me, was a great lesson in learning to be humble and passionate about how you deal with people.
Were you one of those professionals who always saw themselves becoming a CEO, or did you fall into it as some do, just find themselves in that role suddenly?
Yeah, I guess I always joke about this, but it may be not so much of a joke. I was fortunate in when I graduated from university in the days when it was easier to do that. I stepped into an executive role. So I always say I never had a real job because I never worked on the trenches, and I always started an executive, and I always expected that one day I'd work in a CEO role. And so I pretty well started at executive level and moved into being a CEO in my late 30s.
So you mentioned going to that role out of Victoria. Was that when you headed up the Victorian Farmers Federation?
That's right. So I spent about 6 years at the Victorian Farmers Federation, and it was I loved it. The reality is I probably would have still been there if circumstances hadn't altered, and that my parents were getting old and frail, and I wanted to be back in Queensland with my wife and her parents as well. So we came back, and we came back into the local government scene at that time. Fairly tumultuous time for the farming sector there. It was an era during the Branks government, and it was good government to work from the farming sector. It didn't particularly like the farming sector, but as an advocate and a lobbyist and managing a farm lobby group that had a lot to contribute to in Victoria, it was a great learning ground, but it was a really great experience for a really passionate group of people in that state.
Yeah. So you didn't work in local government in Victoria?
I worked in Queensland. Water was always a local government field, and I moved out of Queensland into Victoria, and I worked for Colibin Water, which was a water authority, obviously in central Queensland, and it was again in the Kennett era. A lot of my career is always those interesting opportunities. Kennett was in government at the time I was being recruited, and his aim was to amalgamate a lot of the water authorities and allow territorial growth and expansion. And so I was recruited to Colibin Water to lead that. And of course, history says Kennett was removed, and the issue of expansion of water authorities ceased at that point in time. But it was also a council that had to do an enormous amount of things. We transitioned 21 communities from HSTPs and their own tank water into reticulated water systems, and managed to build the popularity of the water authority during that time of doing it. And that was all done by just great consultation, by being honest and listening to people and testing that and being frank. And so again, great opportunities to learn, great opportunities to practice those learnings further down the track.
Yeah. And that was the era, of course, when Victoria's councils were reduced down to ultimately 79. Exactly. So this is all sort of going on around the same period.
Yeah, and it was. I mean, we work very closely with the councils, water authorities typically tend to do, and there's a great lesson in that. I remember watching that really closely in so many of the areas that I worked in, Bendigo being one of those, where the community said, we don't want to go back to the old way of doing things. We don't want to go back to, a lot of people were happy with administrations because they wanted things got done. No, I don't. I'm a big fan of local government. I always have been, and I love the democratic process. And I think it's really important. I would never subscribe to an administrative model of local government. And in fact, I'm one of those people who would advocate that constitutionally local government should have a place. I don't think it's likely in this country, but there are really good reasons why we shouldn't just be a child of the state, and that we should be able to, because local government is the closest form of government that you get to people, and when we get the basics right, local government's extraordinary, and CEOs who know how to execute on the basics really make an extraordinary contribution along with elected council. So.
That's interesting. You raised the issue of constitutional recognition for local government. Of course, there have been attempts to have that addressed, and some very strong and logical people have got their fingers burned and just been burned out basically at the effort, which never went anywhere. Do you think that is dead in the water for at least our lifetime?
I think so. I mean, I guess the challenge is people don't like government as a rule, and in this country, I mean, we always say we're a great, almost anarchist type country, but we're really a compliance-driven nation. We love to follow the rules. That's the reality of this country. And but we don't like government. We don't like three tiers of government. We think we're overgoverned, and so yeah, I think local government serves a really strong purpose, but I just don't see that there'll ever be a community position that will support having a constitutional push. If it was ever there, when it was ever a likelihood, I'd be there bootstraps and all trying to push for it, because I just think that's the role that local government can really play for its community.
Yeah. So let's get back to the journey. So you've gone back to Queensland from Victoria. You've talked about Bow Desert, which is part of Scenic Rim now, isn't it? One of the bigger growing.
Got amalgamated, split in half to Logan City Council, which was one of my old employers, and then Scenic Rim and New Council.
Yeah.
At the time, the option was that I would take over Scenic Rim, but I kind of felt that new councils, new CEOs, so moved that on, and they went their way, and I decided to go back to doing some consulting. And probably within a couple of months after doing that, I was approached to take over Rockhampton Regional Council. Now, it was an amalgamated council, which was four desperately financially strapped councils into one large financially strapped challenging council. Very, very different. And so I was there for a couple of years and leading that amalgamation process and the rebuilding, which was really great challenge and an interesting challenge.
So I wanted to ask you, there are some very large councils now in Queensland as a result of those processes, and people often put forward amalgamation as the panacea for the troubles that, smaller councils have. What is your view? Is Queensland in a better place now because of those amalgamation processes?
I think overall they are.
Yeah.
And I have to say, even at the time, being a CEO of a council that was abolished, I was a strong supporter of the amalgamations. I mean, in Queensland, there were a lot of populations with very small councils, huge distances that councils had to try and service, and no way that the rate population could service that well. And that's a disservice to the community, because it's constantly having to fund things that it just can't keep pace with and do well with. And so getting down from about 150 councils to 75 seemed like a smarter step. And I think overall, the state has seen the benefit of that. Now, it is interesting that the council that I actually went to, which was four councils into one, as soon as the government changed, actually had been leading a charge. And there's a great lesson in, I always think when amalgamations happen, one of the things the government should do is never let mayors run in the election as councillors, because Rockhampton was a great example of that. Toowoomba was an example where it worked. I think there were five mayors of different disparate councils that moved into one council, and they just fought constantly, and the community wasn't well served by that. In Rockhampton, just because there was a very passionate mayor who constantly sought to undermine the council, they got their way, and without a normal referendum style arrangement, they just got over the line and managed to de-amalgamate, and so Livingstone was formed. Now, as it's worked out, I think Livingstone's worked really well. That, in hindsight, great decision. I think the council at Livingstone is doing a great job, and they've got a long way to go, and they've got a lot of challenges ahead of them. But I think the current council is a great council that's doing some really good work. Wasn't always that way, but it's fine as straps. The challenge, of course, was the amalgamation process for that council into Rockhampton cost about $14 million for the council, and that means the ratepayers. And to de-amalgamate, because all of the systems had to be blown away. Interestingly, four councils that sat together had very few systems that actually talked to each other. So whole new finance system, totally rebuilt from scratch. Record system, rebuilt from scratch. Rate systems, rebuilt from scratch. So huge cost to the ratepayers and the community. And then a de-amalgamation to follow not more than one term after that. And that same cost gets re-incurred again as all of that data has to be stripped out, new systems built. And there will be those who will argue, and rightly so, that Livingstone is still 10 years on coping with that de-amalgamation process, and ratepayers are paying for that. Time will tell if it's a great decision. I think it will work out a good decision, but largely on the back of a council that's really been quite focused on where it needs to be, and it could ultimately be a very different outcome for them.
And you were the interim at Livingstone not that long back, weren't you?
I was there,
Before,
yeah. Last year, I spent about 5 months as the interim CEO for that council. And again, some of the challenges. A new council wasn't happy with the CEO, decided that wasn't going to be a long-term prospect, so that CEO moved on, and the council wanted to go to market. And so I was contacted to go and do some work with them to help them recruit for a new CEO. And that was an interesting experience in its own right, because it continued to demonstrate for me why so many councils get it wrong when they're recruiting, and some get it really well and right. And we did a lot of work with this council to make sure they understood what they were like. The focus for us was making sure that they weren't going to have a fight in the council room about the appointment of the CEO, that they were all going to be unified going forward on appointment of the CEO, and that they had really clear metrics for what that CEO needed to do going forward. And we had a couple of recruiters who were chasing the work to do that recruitment. We deliberately avoided, because we knew they continued to perpetuate that churn. I'm convinced that some of the recruiters in the local government space perpetuate that churn, and we don't necessarily get great results. So we deliberately chose recruiters from outside the local government specific sector. We had a really good metric system in place, so the council absolutely signed off on what they wanted from a CEO. And even though some of those recruiters still today say to us, we wouldn't have picked him, the person who's appointed in there. Important to note that the council signed off unanimously, and they remain extremely happy with the CEO that they picked. And I think he's doing a great job. I think Terry Dodds, who came from Murray River Council, who have just recently appointed their new CEO, is doing a great job in that council, and they'll do good things over the next few years.
There's a bit of a trend actually emerging. Terry Dodds has been on this program not that long back when he was at Murray River. David Keenan's been on, and he's of course at Scenic Rim. But I did want to get into the CEO space, and you've touched on some of that there. But I'm interested in your comment about recruiters. It's a fairly provocative view that recruiters in the sector perhaps are invested in the churn because it creates ongoing business. Is that essentially what you're arguing?
Yeah, that probably means none of the local government recruiters are ever going to touch me with a bars pole now from here on in. It's probably one of those death knells. Lucky I don't need to work. I do think that. I think one of the challenges, if you watch as I do, and I've been doing this for quite a few years, the churn that happens in local government. The local government of Queensland and a number of the association and a number of the associations for local government say this. The average tenure of a CEO in local government is about 2.5 years. It's not even a term of government anymore. And part of that reason is, I'm convinced that it's because councils don't do the right work in the starting point to pick the right CEO. They don't get the metrics right about what their expectations are. They get caught out in some of the other sorts of areas, and then CEOs come in not necessarily with the right direction, but trying to do all of the great things that they need to do. And when councils change, then CEOs become the target for an incoming new administration, and so they get moved on.
Yeah.
And also, that's not the only reason, but a lot of CEOs leave because they don't get the full information before they start. So they find the experience is not a pleasant one when they get there. They don't have full disclosure about all of the challenges, and they're not ready for those challenges, and so it leads to an unhappy marriage between the CEO and the mayor and ultimately the council. And so I think councils have an obligation to make sure they do that well, but recruiters have an even more important, because they're the ones who are bringing people rather than their list of people that they pick and churn, because they know there are a heap of people who are interested in moving, to spend more time at the front end with the council, understanding what it is that makes them tick, and understanding what the metrics are going to be going forward, so that they actually do the right thing in getting the best people for the role on the way through. And hopefully that might lead to better churn, in less churn in the process.
So I want to dig into that a bit. It's a bit of a pet topic of mine as well, Alastair. As we record this, and it'll be a few weeks before this goes out, there's 12, 13 Victorian Council CEO positions up for grabs, basically, at various levels. There's been quite a bit of changeover in Queensland. some in New South Wales as well. What is your take on the current state of the role of a CEO in councils? It's different now, isn't it, than when you and I were first in these roles?
Yeah. I started in local government with some really great CEOs as mentors to guide. In Albert Shire, for instance, Terry Moore, who was the CEO then, he went to be the first CEO of the Amalgamated Gold Coast Council, a really brilliant CEO who understood his role and led almost very corporately, but balancing the politics well with a really well supported mayor. And the acts were different by then. Also,
Yeah.
councillors had a very different role than they do now. And the other one was Gary Keller, who was the CEO of Logan City Council. He's been around for a long time, but he was a public servant who got thrown into Logan to form Logan City Council, and we were there at a time when the council could barely afford the salaries for staff, let alone all the massive growth capital expenditure. So not only a really good administrator, but a good leader who understood how to get the best of his people, but protect his people from councillors who had whole lots of ambition and ideas, and wanted to try and interfere constantly in the day-to-day management, but was able to manage that. I think there's a lot less of that. I think council CEOs often get caught up in the politics of organisations these days, and it's hard not to, because that's the way that they're driven. Mayors have a lot more authority, certainly in this state, in Queensland, they have a lot more authority than they used to have, and so they're a point of contact and a point of potential friction. And so it's easy to get offside with them. You've got to really work on that relationship, but also you've got to be prepared to hold the line and when you need to, and protect staff very much so in that space, but be pretty forceful about that where you need to be. So it's certainly challenging. It's interesting to know, because I watched this a lot. And I talked when I went to the interim at Livingstone, for instance. None of the directors wanted to be the acting CEO at the time, and they just didn't want to step up. And I'd be watching this and talking to a lot of people in my other consulting roles that I do, which is tend to what I do for a real job these days, if you can call consulting a real job. But a lot of directors don't want to step up into that fray of CEO, because you can sit safely for a longer time in a director role than you can necessarily in a CEO role. When you're up there, you're right in the gun sights, and so we're seeing less people move up. And even if you look at, for instance, the last couple of appointments of CEOs in Victoria, the ones that have just been announced over the last couple of days, some of those came from director roles, but if you look at the history, you'll notice they were CEOs before they stepped back into a bigger council to a director. So they've got experience in CEOs.
Correct.
And very few are directors. And there are some great directors around this state, I know in Queensland for sure, who you'd love to see step up and become CEOs. And I've spoken to a few of them personally, and they just say, not interested. I've got other things happening. I want to look after my family. I don't want to take that risk. And I think that doesn't stand well for the organisations in the long term.
I've had exactly the same concern for quite some time. I've heard exactly the same comments, and the worry about where the next crop of council CEOs is coming from. Do you think there's a different skill set required now? Is that politicisation of the role something that's now got to be accepted and built into the way someone approaches the role?
Yeah, sadly I do. I think it's hard to be. Any organisation, you need to have some political mass. And one of the reasons why I enjoyed working in the Victorian Farmers Federation, because it's very much a political organisation. Become a professional lobbyist.
Yeah.
And you've got to enjoy that. You've got to be able to do it well. You've got to be able to do it smartly. And I think there are too few CEOs who have worked that out these days. So I think that is a skill set where that wasn't necessarily the case 20, 25 years ago. You could be a good administrator, but it requires so much more these days. It's a tough place to be in the CEO role in local government. And I think it's also misunderstood quite often, and that's not helped often by a lot of mainstream media who are still stuck back in an area where they think local government is about roads, rates and rubbish, when in fact local government hasn't been about roads, rates and rubbish for a long time. It's so much more complex. It's about communities. It's about all the things that go inside of communities. And, sometimes local government strays outside of its boundaries. Everyone does. But it is a complex beast, and to be a successful CEO, you've got to know how to execute in a really complex organisation and juggle the politics as well.
And we all know what happens when you try to take away any service. It might not be roads, rates or rubbish from any community, and just you then find out how valued it is by part of that community, don't you? Very, very difficult to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Alastair, something else also occurred to me while you were speaking then. Directly elected mayors in Queensland, some in New South Wales. We only have one in Victoria, but that landscape is changing over time. Has it become harder, do you think, for professionals in the sector to move across borders as these changes take place?
I don't think so, because I think the leadership principles are largely the same, and I think you can do that well. And I've seen some great CEOs who've managed to traverse the states quite well. I was just thinking while you were saying that about Aaron Johansson, who is now the new CEO for Central Highlands Council in Central Queensland. Really good CEO, a great business operator. He started in Charter Stands in Queensland for a member as a CEO. He moved to, I think it was Murray Goulburn or Goulburn Murray.
Goulburn Mulwarry, I think.
Yeah, that's right. And so he was there for a short period of time, and obviously that didn't work out. But he moved very straight away back into a council back in Queensland. But I think CEOs are traversing quite well. I think Central Coast Council in Tasmania has just appointed a CEO who came out of Victoria. So borders are sort of are not as fixed in the local government space, and that you can do it well if you understand the differences you need to make.
Yeah. You talk about short tenures as CEO, perhaps none shorter than your tenure as the CEO of the city of Onkaparinga. Can you tell us what happened there? This was in 2022.
It started and it didn't start.
Yeah.
That was interesting. So I guess for full disclosure, at the time I'd just spent almost 15 years working for a university in Queensland, leading their international. There's essentially chief operation officer, senior deputy vice chancellor, and had been unhappy for a while, and it didn't work out. And ultimately, I left. Not in circumstances I'd have been happy with. I've always been a public advocate for a whole lot of stuff. Anyone who follows me, and lots of people do, made comments. Some people didn't like the university. Universities are really strange beasts. So they like freedom of speech until it crosses their boundaries, and so they didn't like it. So I was happy to move on. And
so just tell us what the issue was. Was comments you'd made about Grace
Tame?
So
comments I made about, I think it was Grace Tame, and effectively it wasn't about Grace Tame, because I've actually made lots of supporting comments about Grace Tame. But what I essentially was saying was that, this is a part of youth, is we need to have more civilised debate. And I think it was in relation to her appearance at Parliament House. And really what I was saying, and obviously it might have seemed clumsy to some people at the time, that we need to have more civilised debate, and we need to stop doing the sorts of things that we do. Now, I think in my LinkedIn profile, I got about 130,000 views and something like 20 or 30,000 comments, of which 200 were negative and the rest were positive. But the negative, obviously, were the ones that aligned with the university's perspective at the time. And so, I wasn't happy with the university. The university decided that was probably a good time for me to retire, and I was happy to do that. And I moved on. So at the time, Onkaparinga was looking for a CEO, largest council in South Australia. Looked like a good opportunity. Some serious financial issues that it needed to traverse. Had some things that I won't talk about, because I obviously was part of the confidential nature of recruitment in that particular space. Did a presentation, went through the normal process, and unanimously the council voted to appoint me. At that time, a small group of community members decided to protest about that, and some of the council members got nervous about that, and the mayor spoke to me and said, "Hey, listen, we're worried about this." And I said, "Well, look, I'm not travelling to South Australia to take up a role when you're coming up to elections in about 6 months' time, only to think that, well, then probably a change of government, because you guys aren't looking particularly happy. So I'm happy, if you want, I will renegotiate to step away from that role." So council did a deal which suited my financial perspective, and which I also won't talk about, and I stepped away. So again, I stepped away before I even started on the council, and it's instructive to note that pretty well nearly all of that council got voted out after the election. So in hindsight, I was kind of happy because it seemed like I'd made the right call at that point. Uh, it hasn't affected me in any particular way, but I did make a conscious decision, probably step away permanently from working in the local government space other than as a consultant or in one of the other roles I play, which is actually working with councils in software, in platforms, which is in booking systems, which I think is where
Right.
councils can make real contributions. So at the
Or
moment,
interim roles, obviously, as you did.
yeah, interim roles, which I love, and again, the focus on there is not necessarily just working as an interim for the sake of it, but working for councils who are setting up for the long term, who want to employ good CEOs but want to get the work done right in the first place, or who have a particular challenge that they need done and need someone who can help sort that out for them.
So, do you feel like you were a victim of cancel culture?
It's easy to do that, but I don't believe in that sort of. We make choices. We all make conscious choices, and CEOs and councils and local government and everywhere make conscious choices about what they do. I've always held the view that there are times when you need to be quiet and times when you need to speak up. And again, I go back to my history as a lobbyist and leading lobbying organisations and having to speak up publicly for things. So I've never resolved from that. And I've always been very public in saying to councils, and the same thing in Onkaparinka. When Onkaparinka asked me those questions, I was quite forthright saying, this is who I am. You don't take it or don't make the appointment. And they subsequently made the appointment. So, but I don't think anyone really gets to talk about the culture of, the world is what it is and you have to traverse it and negotiate it as you go.
So no regrets?
Never. No, never.
A couple of other quick things. You sort of touched on civility in a way in some of your responses there. It's been a hot topic in recent times. We've talked about it a lot on this show and even been involved in some international summits on the issue. How big a deal do you think this rise of incivility, as it's been called, is for local government being able to make good decisions?
Yeah, I think it's a really important issue. I mean, it's a global problem. In the university sector, I worked on the global stage. I spent, on average, half a year for the 15 years that I was there outside of the country working and talking to governments in different countries all around the world. I spent more time in the international space then. And, it's very different in particularly a lot of Asian cultures compared to Australian cultures. And social media has a lot to play for that. That notion of being able to make comment without fear of consequence has really led the way. And I watch call centres, for instance, in councils where the poor officers who sit there just literally get abused, with sometimes the foulest of language, and then the CEO gets the call because ultimately no one else in the council wants to touch the call. And councillors experience that almost on a daily basis because people have lost that ability to be civil. And I always say, go hard, argue as hard as you like, as hard as you want to on the topic, but that doesn't mean to say there's a reason to go and be abusive to people for that particular space for the sake of it. There just is no reason to do that. But I think the world has made its choice because it follows social media really strongly in that area, and there's a lot to be said that's positive about social media. We've never had so much access to information as we have these days, but people have to learn to be smarter in the way they use that information. And in local government, it's certainly made a decision. So the notable change in local government is that small groups who are very vocal and noisy can upset the apple cart quite easily because councillors quite often can't distinguish between that loud noise and actual community support. And that's a lesson that CEOs need to constantly take on board and work at. And I spent a lot of my time throughout my career in working with mayors and vice chancellors in teaching them how to hold their nerve when it looks like the world's against them. And knowing when to fold and knowing when not to. Some people might say, well, you haven't worked out too well for you. But in fact, it has. As I said, 55, I retired essentially, didn't need to work again because I made good choices along the way. And I think people have to learn to be more civil, but also to discern from the noise, from what's real.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, do we ride this out, or is there a solution to this lack of civil discourse?
I think the solution is not on a lifetime, sadly. I think social media and digital media is evolving at such a pace that people have lost track of it and haven't learnt that social norms haven't kept pace with the development of social media as quickly. And governments have made fairly ham-fisted attempts to try and control it. And then what we're now seeing is the rise of, uh, I guess, antagonism about loss of free speech, which some people conflict to be, you can say anything you like, and that's free speech. It isn't really, but governments haven't dealt with it well at all levels of government, and that includes local government. I think we've got to continue to make sure that dialogue is respectful, and it keeps going. But we've also got to be resilient. There's an important part of this that we've lost resilience, and in local government, I see this a lot where we try to shut down conversation just because we don't like it or because we think, and people don't go away. They just merely choose to rechannel that. So you've got to be resilient, and you've got to teach your staff how to be resilient in the face of that. We see a lot more, and the work health and safety rules have changed a lot. So psychosocial stress is one of those big issues, and CEOs will say, well, we're not going to allow people to say anything because we now have an obligation to protect stress. No, that doesn't fix the problem, because all you do is stop the problem at one point and it moves to somewhere else, and the council pays the price of that. You've got to teach your staff how to manage stress and how to manage conversations effectively so that they can deal with that, but also they can channel that effectively for good results. And if you do that, you manage to deal with those problems. But acting as a constant censor doesn't fix the problem; it often makes it worse.
We've covered a lot of ground, Alastair, and we could talk for hours. Perhaps one issue we haven't touched on before we wrap up is the financial sustainability of the sector. We hear a lot about councils doing it tough, wanting to put rates up. We've got rate cap environments in New South Wales and Victoria, and that's really playing out in New South Wales at the moment. And a lot of hostility towards councils that have had the temerity to say that we need to put our rates up more. What's the answer here? Is the sector crashing towards a cliff, or is it being blown out of proportion, do you think?
Look, that's a great question, and I reckon if I had the answer to that, I'd have no end of people wanting me to do other work for them. But the reality is, and I think the campaign that local government is running at the moment about, we've been funding the same way as we have in the 70s it's a pretty good campaign, but I don't actually think it resonates. I don't think people are listening or taking much, because in their own hip pocket, all they're seeing is, hang on, the cost of living is getting higher for me constantly, and councils just imposing an even bigger rates, and what are they delivering? Because all the things that councils are often being forced to deliver, and what we always have to remember is, sometimes what happens is that councils get forced by state governments, their parents, to offer services that they actually don't adequately remunerate for. And that means the pressure is constantly on council to increase services but not get remunerated for. And somewhere along the line, it actually then, and the state understands this, because it knows that then the local government has to go back to ratepayers and they have to stump up the cost. And the local government then wears the heat for it, not the state government. So it's an easy and convenient way for state government to get councils to do their bidding without feeling the heat for it. I think the challenge for local government is it can't keep putting rates up. And some of the cases we've seen are 40% hikes. Ultimately, we'll get those councillors turfed. They just won't survive those sorts of rate hikes. And what will happen? New councils come in, but nothing will change. I think councils have to be really smart about protecting their sustainability, and that is going to result in streamlining services. One of the things I've always done as a CEO is also to my executives, every year they've got to show me at least a 20% reduction in policy initiatives. So, one thing councils are great at is creating policy. One thing councils are not good at is rescinding or stripping away policy. So we build up, but we don't take away. And it no more apparent than it is in the development side, where people get very frustrated in the development sector where they can't build because there are so many layers of approvals that need to go through. And quite often a lot of it is meaningless. And so it ends up in the courts. And you see lots of examples happening on a regular basis where councils lose the fight in the court. It's because they relied on policies that don't work for them, and the courts recognise that and so give to developers. But along the way, everyone pays a lot of money to try and solve that problem, which ultimately both from the developer, who charges high prices for their properties that they sell, and for the council that has to pay for these increasing legal fees that become a feature of the way that local government works. And the ratepayer picks it all up along the way. So I think we've got to be smarter at streamlining policy where it doesn't serve as well. And it should be a natural part of a CEO's arsenal to make his executives constantly looking at ways of streamlining things that are less relevant and not adding layers where there's, for instance, the state and the environment sector is a really good space for that, where local government seems to be wanting to put in new policies for things that state already do. So we're creating layer and layer and layer and just making the bureaucracy really difficult to manage along the way. And if we don't do that, then our sustainability is always going to be questionable.
Yeah. So, as I say, we've covered a lot of ground. There's a few challenging issues there that are facing the sector. Do you think about the future of the local government sector in Australia with positivity or despair, if I could put it that way?
I think overwhelmingly, I'm still positive about I think it's got its challenges, and we shouldn't try to hide from that. But I've always said this in the 30 plus years that I've worked in the sector. Local government is by far the best connected government level to communities. They offer so much more and so much positive outcomes. Doesn't mean to say there won't be a lot of challenges along the way, but I would never work in state or in federal or state government. So I'd always work in local government because contribution to the way that people live is by far superior to anything anyone can offer. And I think that's really positive for the sector generally.
Thank you for the open and frank discussion. It's been a pleasure to sit down with you and to meet you. And I wish you all the best for whatever else you would like to be doing in and around local government in the years to come.
Thanks for the opportunity to have a chat.
Thanks for joining me for this latest instalment in the Well-Travelled Executive Series. Don't forget to check out the other episodes in the series from the Local Government News Roundup, Australia's #1 podcast for news and interviews about the local government sector in Australia and beyond. The podcast is brought to you by the Victorian Local Governance Association, the national broadcaster on all things local government, with support from Symphony 3, simple, connected customer experiences. Our program is produced in the city of Greater Geelong on the land of the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I hope you'll join me again soon. Until then, thanks for listening and bye for now. I'm thrilled to welcome Symphony 3 to the Local Government News Roundup family. If you're a local council, you know how challenging it can be to manage data across all your different systems. That's where Symphony 3 comes in. They've developed Smart Glue, a platform that integrates over 55 council systems, automating data flow without the need for manual work. It turns confusion into simplicity. With Smart Glue, councils save time, reduce errors and empower staff to focus on what really matters. Their clients see a real difference, up to 20% boost in productivity, with savings of over $30,000 per integration every year. Symphony 3 helps councils work smarter, faster and more efficiently, all while better supporting the communities they serve.